Chapter 4, we will discuss the development of the face and palate. We will describe prenatal facial development during that 4th through 7th week of gestation. We will describe palatal development, which occurs during the 7th to the 9th weeks of gestation. We will explain how the tongue and thyroid develop, the development of facial and palatal clefts, and other facial defects. First, we'll talk about tissue organization. The face develops from tissues that surround that oral pit. The forehead will develop from the frontal process, which is above the oral pit and covers the brain, and then the right and left maxillary processes, which are lateral to that oral pit, will develop into cheeks, and the mandibular arch below the oral pit will form the lower jaw. In this image, you can see the frontal process, which is shown in pink, and as we stated, that covers the brain. You can see this darkness in the middle is the oral pit, and on the lateral sides of the oral pit, or stomodium, is what that will become known as the primitive mouth. Maxillary processes are developing, and here the blue is the mandibular arch, which is our first pharyngeal arch, and then we have the hyoid arch under that. So the 4th week, the facial tissues measure only a few millimeters in height and width and are as thin as a sheet of paper. Further growth of the face is anterior to the brain. Below that mandibular arch is the second pharyngeal arch, or the hyoid arch, and its muscles will expand into and contribute to the face. The hyoid arch will form part of the external and middle ear as well. During the 4th week, that primitive mouth, or that oral pit, is surrounded by several masses of tissue. The frontal process of the brain bulges forward and laterally and will dominate that facial area. Below the frontal processes are 2 small wedge-shaped tissues known as maxillary processes. They are lateral to the oral pit. Beneath those maxillary processes is the mandibular arch, which will appear to constrict at that midline. And this is all happening during that 4th week. In the 5th week, the nasal placodes appear in the upper border of the lip. These will develop into nostrils, which will result in 2 slits that open into the oral pit. That frontal area becomes the frontonasal process. The nostrils will begin to deepen, and tissues around the nostrils grow anteriorly, and the intranasal area represents the width of the face. The eyes become prominent on the side of the head. I feel like at this point it looks somewhat like E.T., if you guys know who E.T. is. This is kind of what we're looking at. You can see the nasal pit, or the slits where the nostrils will be. The eyes are out to the side of the head. The oral pit is right there in the middle, that dark center area. And you can see the mandibular arch below those maxillary processes, and the hyoid arch is the orange. During the 6th week, those lateral parts of the face begin to expand. This is due to the lateral expansion and growth of the brain inside the head. The eyes and maxillary processes move more towards the front of the face, and the mouth slit will widen, which causes the maxillary and mandibular tissues to merge. You can see the lateral nasal processes are beginning to spread out, and the medial nasal processes are appearing, making it look more and more like a nose. The maxillary processes are spreading out as well, and these auricular hillocks that you see in the blue are going to form the ear later on. The nasal processes are in the middle of the upper lip, and the face appears more human during the 6th week. That upper lip is composed of a medial nasal process known as the philtrum, and then there are two lateral maxillary segments. So lateral to the nasal pits is the lateral nasal process, and the tissue medial to the nasal pits is the medial nasal process. So this is what that looks like. We're looking at the development of the floor of the nasal pit. So you can see the maxillary process comes up on the side. This is at about 6 weeks and then 6.5 weeks. So we've got the lateral nasal process and the medial. Medial is towards the middle or towards the midline of your body. Lateral is the outer part of the nostril. And then the nasal fin is that area of the nose that kind of connects it to that upper lip on the outside. You can see that at 6.5 weeks on the lateral side of that nostril. In the 6th week, that first pharyngeal groove will form the ear canal or auditory tube. This appears below the corners of the mouth. And those auricular hillocks that I showed you a couple slides back, there are 6 of those that group around the external ear canal. 3 will form from the mandibular arch, or that first arch, and 3 from the hyoid arch, or that second arch. And this is what those look like, and they will eventually become your outer ear. At the 7th week, the face has a more human appearance. The lateral growth of the brain has occurred and eyes have moved to the front of the face. They're in the same horizontal plane as the nostrils. The upper lip has fused and created that philtrum, or that center part up above your lips. The hillocks have fused to form ears, and ridges around the eyes will soon form eyelids. At the 7th week, the fear of cleft lip is no longer an issue. Cleft palate can still occur because we haven't had the palate elevation, but we do, at this point, the lip has fused, so cleft lip would no longer be a fear. This is what our human face would look like at the 7th prenatal week. You can see the eyes are forward, the nose is starting to look more normal, and the maxillary processes have fused with that. The medial and lateral palatal processes are going to form the maxillary palate. So the palate separates the oral and nasal cavities. So if we didn't have a palate, the inner part of our nose would be open right into the mouth. And that palate will develop from an anterior wedge-shaped medial part and 2 lateral palatine processes. The medial palate, or the primary palate, develops first and is the floor of the nasal pits. Here's if you were to look up at the palate while it's developing, you've got the medial palatine process, which will become the future premaxilla. And then we've got 2 lateral palatine processes that will grow towards the midline and come together in the middle. The medial and lateral palatine processes, the lateral palatine processes is the secondary palate. They develop from maxillary tissues laterally and grow towards the midline. As they grow medially, they will contact the tongue, and after contacting the tongue, these processes will grow downward on either side of the tongue. At about that 8th prenatal week, we will see the palate elevate and close. So the posterior shelves will push together and force the tongue forward and down. This occurs very, very rapidly as these palatine processes flip up over the descending tongue. It happens so rapidly, they aren't able to even catch this happening. So it's a very fast process once those palatal shelf elevate and close. So if we look at this image, we're kind of looking at a drawing compared to what it would look like in the mouth. So we've got the nasal septum that comes down in the middle, and you've got nasal chambers on either side. And then if you look below, you've got the tongue represented in the middle of A, And then you've got the palatine shelves are the darker pink lines represented on either side of that tongue. And then in the mouth, this is what that would look like. You see the primary palate, the nasal septum area, the palatine shelves are represented here in the drawing. And then if you look at the lower, this is when they have raised. So we've got the nasal septum again, and we've got the nasal chambers represented on either side of that. The oral cavity, the tongue has descended down, and you can see that the palatal shelf has elevated and is now separating the oral cavity from the nasal cavity. So as far as the body and the base of the tongue, the muscles of the head, including the tongue, arise from the mesoderm, which are the occipital myotomes. These muscles will migrate anteriorly to the floor of the mouth, and they're joined by other muscles of the first and second pharyngeal arches. The tongue is innervated by the fifth cranial nerve, which is the sensory nerve to the anterior of the tongue, the seventh cranial nerve, which is a receptor to the anterior third or body of the tongue. The ninth cranial nerve is a receptor to the posterior third or base of the tongue. And then the 10th cranial nerve also innervates the tongue. The anterior, more movable part of the tongue develops from that first pharyngeal arch during that 4th week. And then that posterior part, or less movable part of the tongue, develops from the 2nd and 3rd pharyngeal or bronchial arches. The tissues of the tongue have 3 parts. There are 2 lateral lingual swellings. These rapidly enlarge and merge and overgrow the central tubercle. This kind of develops from that tuberculum impar. So you can see here the tubercular impar is kind of at the base or behind the V in the tongue, which is known as the terminal sulcus. We've got these lateral swellings on either side that quickly enlarge and merge. And you can see the body of the tongue on the image to the right. The foramen cecum is represented here. The palatine tonsils you can see, the epiglottis, the laryngeal orifice. So all of this is kind of showing where we start, and you can see the pharyngeal arches represented out to the side as well. The body and the base of the tongue are separated by a V-shaped groove called that terminal sulcus, which you can see in the image below. Behind the terminal sulcus, the base of the tongue forms the lingual tonsil on the dorsal surface, and the lingual tonsil forms part of Wildeyer's ring in the pharynx along with the palatine and pharyngeal tonsils. As far as the thyroid gland, during the development of the epithelium at the base of the tongue will begin to migrate into the neck. During that migration, the thyroid gland remains attached to the tongue by an epithelial cord called the thyroglossal duct, and eventually that duct becomes solid and disappears. So the thyroid starts and then descends down into its final resting place down in the neck. Cysts and fistulas may be found along the path of the descent of thyroid tissue. So you can see on the neck of this person on the upper image, there is a blind pocket lined with thyroid epithelium, and that is a cyst. And on the lower one, it's a fistula. The swelling has an opening in the neck, on the surface of the neck. A cyst is just enclosed blind pocket, and a fistula is an opening that you can actually drain from. Some malformations that can occur during this whole process, the facial and palatal clefts occur due to a combination of environmental and genetic factors. Susceptibility to stress can have adverse effects during this time of formation. Cleft lip is the most common facial malformation that we see, but a child can develop cleft lip, cleft palate, cleft mandible. So there's lots of defect that can occur during this merging of the facial tissues. In the white population in the United States, cleft lip occurs every 1 in 700 births. White boys have nearly 2 times the number of cleft lip and cleft palate as girls. White girls have more cleft palates, with 1 in every 2,000 births. And there are significantly fewer African Americans that have clefts, only about 1 in 2,000. And in the Asian population, only 3 in 2,000 births do we see clefting. And you can see in these images, we've got a single cleft in the first child up into the nostril. The second is a complete clefting up into the nostril where that did not fuse. And you can see in the third up in the top, we've got the lip is clefted, the nose is clefted right up the middle, and then the child in the bottom has, bottom right is showing cleft mandible as well. So these are all the different types of clefting that we can see. There are numerous other common or rare facial deformities that we see clinically. We can see an oronasal optic cleft, which extends from the mouth to the eye. We can see malocclusions of teeth, which are the most common defects. And we can even see what's called mid-facial hypoplasias, which is Appert's or Cruzon syndromes. These are less common defects. So these are some things that we can see during this time.